The morning Bessie Pritchard carried her grandmother's rocking chair down off the porch and set it in the dust at the edge of the road with a price tag tied to its arm. She told herself she was not crying. She was simply sweating from her eyes, because the Nevada sun had no business being that cruel before 8 o'clock in the morning. It was the autumn of 1874, and the high desert air above the town of Redemption, Nevada, carried the first sharp bite of coming cold. The sagebrush shivered in a low wind that rolled off the Sierra Nevada range and curled down through the valley where the Pritchard Ranch sat on 340 acres of grazing land, good creek water, and enough heartbreak to fill a man twice over. Bessie was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days. She knew the count because every morning she made a small mark with her thumbnail on the doorframe of the kitchen, the same doorframe where her husband Carl had measured their daughter Clara's height every year on her birthday. Clara was 6 now, and she had her father's dark eyes and Bessie's stubborn jaw, and she was currently sitting on the top porch rail watching her mother drag furniture toward the road with the serious, wide-eyed silence of a child who understood that something was very wrong but could not yet name it. Carl Pritchard had died of a fever that swept through the valley in late May. He had been strong and laughing on a Tuesday and delirious by Friday and gone entirely by the following Monday, and the doctor in Redemption, a thin man named Horace Webb, had told Bessie afterward that there was nothing that could have been done differently, that these things happened in the territories, that she ought to write to her family back east. Bessie had no family back east worth writing to. She had the ranch, she had Clara, she had 47 head of cattle, a pair of horses, a border collie named Pepper, and a mortgage note held by the First Territorial Bank of Redemption that came due in payments of $60 every 90 days. Carl had handled the money. Bessie was not stupid about money. She could cipher and she could keep a ledger. But what she discovered when she sat down with the books 3 days after the funeral was that Carl had been borrowing against the next season's cattle revenue for 2 seasons running, and the next payment on the bank note was due in October, and it was now September, and she had $11.30 to her name. She had tried everything she could think of first. She had ridden into Redemption and spoken to Mr. Aldous Crane at the bank, who had a face like a man who had never once laughed and was proud of it. He had listened to her situation with his hands folded on his desk, and then he had told her that the bank was a business, not a charity, and that the payment would be due on the 15th of October, and that if she missed it, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. She had asked about an extension. He had looked at her over his spectacles and said that the bank did not grant extensions to widows any more than it granted them to anyone else, because sentiment was not a sound financial practice. She had thanked him through her teeth and ridden home. She had tried to hire herself out to do washing, but the other women in Redemption who had spare laundry were not many, and what they could pay would not make a dent in $60 in the time she had left. She had tried to see if any of the surrounding ranchers would buy her cattle early, but the cattle market was low that season and the best offer she got was from old Sila's Drum, who owned the spread to the north, and Sila's had offered her $20 for the whole lot, which she recognized as an insult even dressed up as generosity, and she had declined. The furniture was the only thing left. The house was full of solid, good pieces that Carl had brought out on a wagon from Sacramento 3 years ago when they had married, a proper bedroom suite with a tall walnut headboard, a mahogany dining table with 6 matching chairs, a writing desk with brass fittings, a settee with green velvet cushions that Clara liked to press her fingers into, a glass-fronted china cabinet, 2 oil lamps with painted shades, a cedar chest, and the rocking chair that had belonged to Bessie's grandmother and was the only thing she owned that came from before. She had decided she would sell the rocking chair last, because selling it first would feel like defeat, and she was not ready to feel that particular kind of defeat yet. She set it by the road with its price tag, and went back inside to tend the morning chores. Owen Ford came into Redemption in the middle of September 1874 on a steel-gray horse named Admiral that was better bred than most of the people in the county. Owen was 32 years old, tall but not so tall as to be awkward, with dark brown hair that wanted cutting and green eyes that noticed things. He had spent the last 6 years working cattle drives up from Texas, first as a hand, then as a trail boss, and he had saved his wages with the kind of careful, patient discipline that comes from having grown up with very little. He had ridden into Redemption because a man he had once worked with, a cattleman named Bert Stokes, had written him a letter saying there was good land available in the valley and that Owen ought to come look at it. He arrived in the early afternoon and took a room at the Redemption Hotel, which was a 2-story building that smelled of wood smoke and fried onions and optimism. He washed the trail dust off, ate a plate of something that was described as beef stew but was mostly turnips, and then walked the length of the main street to get a sense of the town. Redemption was a proper town by Nevada Territory standards in 1874. It had a bank, a hotel, a mercantile, a livery, a church, a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Silver Spur, and a doctor's office with a hand-painted sign that had the letter D slightly larger than the rest, as though the doctor had given up on proportion midway through. The street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, and the boardwalks on either side were of varying levels of quality, some planks solid and new, others spongy underfoot. He stopped at the mercantile to buy tobacco and a few supplies, and while he was paying at the counter, the woman behind him said to the shopkeeper, "Mr. Garvey, do you know anyone who might want to buy a good dining table? Mahogany with 6 chairs. I am selling it and I need to find a buyer before the end of the week." Owen did not turn around right away, but he listened. There was something in her voice, not desperation exactly, but a controlled steadiness that a person uses when they are working very hard not to sound desperate. He paid for his tobacco and turned as if to leave and got his first look at Bessie Pritchard. She was standing at the counter in a dress that had been washed too many times and was beginning to go thin at the elbows, and her brown hair was pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that was also showing its age, and she was looking at the shopkeeper with an expression of absolute composed dignity. She was, he thought, one of the most self-possessed people he had seen in a long time. There were shadows under her eyes from not enough sleep, and her hands, folded on top of the counter, had the roughness of someone who had been doing hard work for a long time. The shopkeeper, Mr. Garvey, a round-faced man with a kind disposition, was saying that he didn't know of anyone off the top of his head, but that he would mention it around. Owen tipped his hat to the woman as he passed, the automatic courtesy of a man raised in a place where manners cost nothing, and she nodded back with the brief acknowledgement of someone who had more pressing things to think about. He went out into the afternoon sun and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. He had come to Redemption to look at land. He had not come to involve himself in strangers' troubles. He got back on Admiral and rode out toward the acreage that Bert Stokes had mentioned, which was on the western edge of the valley, and he rode around it for an hour looking at the soil and the graze and the water situation, and he thought it was decent land, maybe good land but not exceptional. On his way back into town, he passed the Pritchard ranch. He did not know whose it was. What he saw was a well-kept spread that had clearly been worked by someone who understood cattle and land, though there were signs of recent strain. A fence post down in the south pasture, a gate hanging at an angle, small neglected things that happen when there are not enough hands and not enough hours in the day. And at the edge of the road, almost at the property line, there was a rocking chair sitting in the late afternoon light with a handwritten price tag on its arm. He slowed Admiral and looked at it for a long moment. It was a good chair, made of ash or possibly hickory, with curved runners worn smooth from years of use, the kind of chair that had been sat in by someone beloved. He rode on. That night at the Silver Spur Saloon, He fell into conversation with a man named Pete Hollies, who had worked the valley for 20 years and knew everybody's business the way only people with too much time and not enough discretion ever do. Pete had red side whiskers and a habit of leaning too close when he talked, and within 30 minutes of sitting down beside Owen at the bar, he had told him about the widow Pritchard. "Carl was a good man," Pete said, signaling the barkeeper for another glass. "Terrible shame what happened. Woman's been scrambling ever since. She's got a little girl, and that mortgage note coming due, and old Aldous Crane over at the bank won't give her a breath of room. Word is she's been selling off her household things trying to make up the payment. Selling them herself, just setting them out by the road. Stubborn as a Missouri mule, that one. Won't take help from anyone, won't ask. But she's going to lose that place if she can't come up with $60 by October 15th, and the way things are going, I don't see how she does it." Owen drank his whiskey and said nothing, because he was a man who thought before he spoke, which was a quality that served him well in most situations, and occasionally made people think he was slow-witted, which he was most certainly not. He paid for his drink and Pete's and walked back to the hotel, and he lay on the bed in his room with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling and told himself that it was none of his business. He got up before sunrise the next morning, which was a habit from years of trail work, and he saddled Admiral and rode out to look at the western acreage again in the early light, because land looks different in the morning. On the way back, just as the sky was going from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before first light, he came past the Pritchard property again. The rocking chair was still at the roadside. He stopped. He sat on Admiral in the blue dark for a long moment. Then he dismounted, tied Admiral to a fence post, took the price tag off the chair, set the money the tag listed in a small fold under a rock where it would not blow away, and carried the rocking chair up the porch steps and set it gently against the wall where it clearly lived, because there was a faded pale rectangle on the porch boards where it had sat for years. He was back on Admiral and away before the first actual line of light broke over the eastern hills. Bessie came out at sunup to start the morning chores, and she stopped dead on the porch and stared at the rocking chair. She looked at it for a full minute. She had set it out the afternoon before. She had not sold it to anyone that she knew of. She walked down to the road and found the fold of money under the rock, which was the exact price she had written on the tag. She stood in the road holding the bills and looked up and down the empty stretch in both directions. And there was nothing to see but sage and the pale dirt road, and the first pink light beginning to color the sky. She went inside and put the money in the tin box on the kitchen shelf and did not say anything to Clara about it, because Clara was still sleeping and because she did not know what she would say. 3 days later, she loaded the mahogany dining table into the wagon with enormous difficulty, because it was a heavy piece and she was one woman, and she drove it into Redemption and stopped in front of the Mercantile and asked if she could display it there. Mr. Garvey, who was a genuinely decent man, said of course, and helped her bring it inside. Owen happened to be at the livery that morning when Pete Hollies passed through and mentioned, without being asked, that Mrs. Pritchard was selling her dining table over at Garvey's Mercantile, and that it was a beautiful piece, solid mahogany, real craftwork. Owen finished what he was doing at the livery and then walked over to Garvey's and looked at the table. Bessie was not there. Garvey told him the price, and Owen counted it out from the roll of bills in his shirt pocket and paid for it. And then he asked Garvey, very calmly, if he would be kind enough to keep it in the back of the store overnight, because he would arrange to have it moved in the morning. Garvey looked at him with the mildly curious expression of a man who suspects something interesting is happening, but has not put it together yet, and said that would be fine. Owen arranged with the boy at the livery to help him load the table onto a rented wagon at 4 in the morning. He drove it out to the Pritchard ranch in the full dark, and he and the boy, a 14-year-old named Tommy who had been paid enough not to ask questions, carried the dining table back up onto the porch, setting it just inside the overhang so it would be protected from the weather, with the 6 chairs stacked neatly beside it. He paid Tommy extra for his silence, not as a bribe but as a fair wage for a job that included discretion, and he drove the rented wagon back to the livery and returned to his room at the hotel and slept for 3 hours. Bessie nearly dropped her coffee when she opened the front door and found her dining table on the porch. She walked around it slowly, the way you walk around something that should not be there but is. The chairs were stacked beside it with a care that was almost tender. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was nothing but the table and the chairs and the beginning of a feeling she did not know what to do with. She asked around. She went to Garvey and described the situation, and Garvey said, in the careful way of a man keeping a confidence he has been paid to keep, that he really couldn't say who might have bought it. She asked Pete Hollies, who knew everything, and Pete looked away and said he hadn't heard anything about that. She rode past the 3 neighboring properties and looked at each one with fresh suspicion, but none of them were likely candidates for this particular kind of generous mystery. She went back to the ranch and sat in her grandmother's rocking chair on the porch in the afternoon and thought about it until the light changed. The following week she sold the writing desk. She had placed an advertisement, handwritten, in the window of the telegraph office, because Emmett Clark, who ran the telegraph, was generous about allowing that sort of thing. She was sitting in the telegraph office talking to Emmett when Owen Ford came in to send a wire. She didn't know who he was. She had seen him once at Garvey's Mercantile and exchanged nothing more than a nod and a hat tip. She looked up when he came in and then looked back at her conversation with Emmett. Owen paid for his wire, which was a message to Bert Stokes saying he was still considering the land situation in Redemption and would be in town a while longer, and on his way out he stopped at the window advertisement. He read it twice. Then he asked Emmett where he could find the writing desk. Emmett pointed across the street. Mrs. Pritchard brought it in this morning. It's over at the hotel lobby. Mr. Harlan said she could display it there. Owen said thank you and walked to the hotel. He looked at the desk. It was a handsome piece with brass fittings on the drawer handles and a green leather writing surface and 2 small pigeonholes at the back. He stood there for a moment, and then he went inside and found Mr. Harlan, the hotel proprietor, and paid for the desk and made the same arrangement as before. This time he asked Tommy from the livery and also Tommy's older brother, a 17-year-old named Sam, to help with the moving, because the desk was awkward and heavy with the brass fittings. They set it on the Pritchard porch before 4 in the morning, 2 days after the sale, placed against the wall where a faint outline on the exterior boards showed where it had stood before. Bessie saw it in the morning light and sat down on the porch steps and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed slowly, carefully, and did not cry because she had promised herself she was done with crying. She was done with it as a luxury she could not afford. But she sat there for a long time looking at the desk, and the feeling that had been building since the rocking chair returned and settled into her chest like a warm coal. Someone was watching out for her. She did not know who, and she did not know why, and she did not know whether to feel grateful or angry or frightened, because being looked after without your knowledge or consent can feel like kindness or like surveillance depending on the disposition of the person doing it, and Bessie's disposition was, by necessity, cautious. She began to pay attention. The next Sunday she went to church, as she always did, taking Clara an address that Bessie had let out at the hem. The Redemption Church was a white-painted building with a bell that had a crack in it and rang slightly flat, and Reverend Means delivered sermons of exactly 40 minutes by the clock, which the congregation appreciated. Bessie sat in her usual pew, 3rd from the front on the left, and she noticed, 2 pews back on the right, a man she did not recognize. Tall, dark hair, a green eye catching the light when he turned his head. He was sitting alone and he was listening to the sermon with the genuine attention of someone who had a real faith rather than the performed attention of someone who was there to be seen. After the service, in the yard outside, she watched him. He spoke to Pete Hollies and to Reverend Means and to the blacksmith Jake Crandall with the easy manner of someone comfortable in his own skin. He helped Mrs. Eula Chambers carry a basket she had brought and forgot back to her wagon without being asked to do it. He noticed Clara's dog Pepper, who had come along uninvited as he always did, and he crouched down and let Pepper sniff his hand and then scratched him behind the ear in exactly the right spot, which made Pepper lean into him with the total trust of a dog who is an excellent judge of character. Clara pulled Bessie's hand. "Mama, that man knows how to pet a dog." "I see that," Bessie said. She watched him stand back up, and as if he felt the attention, he turned his head and their eyes met. He did not look away immediately, which she noticed. He nodded in that brief way he had, the same nod as at the mercantile, and she nodded back, and then Pete Hollies said something to him and he looked away. She asked Pete that afternoon. "Oh, that's Owen Ford," Pete said, with the pleased expression of a man who loves being asked things. "Trail boss came up from Texas. Good reputation, I asked around. He's been looking at the Dawson land on the west side of the valley, thinking about settling, buying his own spread. Been here about 3 weeks. Stays at the hotel, quiet man mostly, keeps his own counsel." That night Bessie sat at the writing desk, which was back where it belonged, in the corner of the sitting room, and she thought about what she knew. A man named Owen Ford. Quiet. Keeps his own counsel. Recently arrived. Had been looking at land. She thought about the timing of the furniture appearing on her porch and the timing of his arrival in Redemption, and she thought about how those two things lined up in a way that her mind could not quite dismiss. She told herself she was probably wrong. It was a leap of logic, she said to herself. But she was a woman who had kept a ranch running alone for 4 months, and she had learned to trust the pattern-reading part of her mind, because it was usually right. She decided she needed to know for certain. 2 weeks before the October payment was due, she sold the settee with the green velvet cushions. Clara cried a little about that one, quietly, in the way children cry when they do not want to upset the adult who is already upset. Bessie hugged her for a long time and told her that things were just things, and that the most important things you could not carry out the door on a wagon, and Clara said, "Like Papa." And Bessie said yes, like Papa, and held her tighter. This time, instead of simply selling the settee and waiting to see what happened, Bessie made a plan. She arranged with Mr. Garvey to display the settee in his window, and she told him she would check on it each morning. Then, on the second morning after putting it in the window, she rose before 4 o'clock in the complete black of the early Nevada morning, wrapped her shawl around her, and walked down the road to the edge of her property, where she could see the porch in the moonlight, and she waited. She waited a very long time in the cold dark. The stars were enormous over the valley, spread so thick in the October sky that they seemed to lean down. Pepper had followed her and sat against her legs, which she was grateful for, because the night was cold and a dog is good company in the dark. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the slow creak and muffled footfall of a team being driven carefully, slowly, the way you drive when you are trying not to make noise. The wagon came up the road from the direction of town and pulled over at her property line, and in the darkness, she could just make out the shape of 2 men and the bulk of something on the wagon bed, and one of the men was tall. She watched them carry the settee up onto her porch with a care and quietness that was almost sacred, and she felt something shift inside her, deep down, like a tectonic thing, like something that has been holding in one position for a long time and has finally, reluctantly, begun to move. When they came back down off the porch, the taller man stopped at the bottom of the steps and stood still for a moment, and she could see in the faint moonlight that he was looking at the ranch with an expression she could not quite read from where she stood. Then they got back on the wagon and turned it, and she stepped out of the shadow and said, quite clearly into the dark, "Mr. Ford." He went still. The wagon horse shifted. The other man, the young one, made a small startled sound. She walked toward the wagon. She could see him now, see the line of his jaw and the straight set of his shoulders, and she stopped about 6 feet from the wagon side and looked up at him. "It's you," she said, not a question. He took his hat off, which she thought was the most dignified response possible to being caught in an act of anonymous charity. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I heard about your situation," he said finally. "It seemed like an injustice. You spent your own money." "I can afford to," he said simply. "I don't want charity," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't give you any. I bought the furniture. It's mine to do with as I please, and it pleased me to put it back where it belonged." She stood looking up at him in the dark, and the cold air moved through the sage, and Pepper, who had followed her from the shadows, went and sat between the wagon wheels and looked up at Owen as though he was an old friend. "You'll lose money," she said. "I haven't lost anything," he said. "A man who spends money on a worthwhile thing hasn't lost it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He looked as surprised by that as she was to have said it. He tied the reins and told the boy Tommy to wait, and he came down off the wagon, and she turned and walked to the house, and he followed. The kitchen was warm because she had kept the stove going before she went to wait in the cold, and the lamplight was low and amber, and made the room feel small and close in a comfortable way. She put the coffee on and stood at the stove with her back to him, and she could feel him behind her the way you feel the presence of someone who is paying attention, a kind of warmth that is more than just body heat. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. He had his hat in his hands and he turned it slowly, and she noticed that about him, that he did things with his hands when he was thinking, the way some people talk. She brought the coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I didn't think about how it might feel to you, to find your things coming back without knowing why or from who. That wasn't considerate." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "It was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a long time," she said. "I just needed to know who was doing it and why." "I told you why," he said. "It was unjust. A woman working alone to keep what's hers and having to sell her grandmother's rocking chair to make a bank payment because her husband died. That's unjust." "The world has a great deal of injustice in it," she said. "It does," he agreed. "I can't fix all of it, but I was standing right next to this particular piece of it, and I had the means to do something, so I did." She looked at him carefully. He was not a handsome man in the way that painters depicted men, but he had a face that rewarded looking at, a face that had thought deeply about things and weathered them and come through more or less intact, with a quality of steadiness that she recognized as the real kind, not the performed kind. "You've been in redemption 3 weeks," she said. "About that." Looking at the Dawson land. He looked at her with a slight widening of his eyes, just a fraction. "You've been asking about me," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I wanted to know who was visiting my porch in the dark," she said evenly. He did smile then, briefly, and it changed his face considerably for the better. "Fair enough," he said. He drank his coffee. "The Dawson land is decent, not what I hoped for, but I'm not in a hurry. I've been looking at other parcels." They talked for an hour. It was the most remarkable thing. They simply talked about the land and the valley and the cattle market and the weather and what the winters were like in Nevada. And it was natural and easy in a way that surprised both of them. She could see it surprised him too, see it in the way he kept glancing at her with a slight quality of wondering. She told him about the ranch, about Carl, about the mortgage, about her daughter. He listened in the complete way that very few people actually listen, his attention fully present, not rehearsing his next comment while she spoke. When the coffee was done and she stood to refill it, he said, "How much is the payment?" She looked at him. "That is not your concern, Mr. Ford." "Owen," he said. "That is not your concern," she said again, but without heat. "It is my concern," he said, "because I would like to help if I can, not as charity. As a business arrangement, if you're willing to discuss one." She sat back down. "What kind of arrangement?" "I've been looking at land to run a cattle operation," he said. "I have capital, I know cattle." What I don't have is an established spread with good water and proven grazing, and a woman who clearly knows how to run a ranch." She was very still. "I'm not proposing a partnership," he said carefully. "Not yet. I don't know you and you don't know me, and I wouldn't insult either of us by proposing something as significant as that on an hour's acquaintance. What I'm proposing is that you consider it as a possibility worth exploring, and in the meantime, I would like to buy the remaining furniture for fair market prices, which I believe we've established I'm going to do anyway, and I would like to help with the fence in your south pasture, because a fence post down in cattle country is a problem that compounds itself." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the first gray of actual dawn was beginning at the edge of the sky, and a rooster somewhere on the neighboring property was making its announcement. "You notice the fence," she said. "I notice things," he said simply. "What would you want from this arrangement?" she said. "You said not a partnership, so what would it be?" "I'd want to understand the operation," he said, "to work it alongside you, to see how we work together, and then if it seems right to both of us to talk about something more permanent." She looked down at her coffee cup. "You are speaking about more than a business arrangement," she said quietly. "I am being very careful not to," he said. "Because you are 4 months a widow, and it would be wrong of me to be anything other than straightforward about what I can and cannot offer right now, which is exactly what I said. Work, time, fair dealing." She looked up at him. She had been alone for 4 months and 3 weeks and some days, and she had been holding the whole weight of everything by herself, and she was very tired, and he was sitting across from her in her kitchen in the lamplight that was going amber to gray as the dawn came on. And he was, she thought, exactly the kind of man who was dangerous to a woman in her situation, not because he would harm her, but because he was the kind of man who made you want to put the weight down. "All right," she said. "Come tomorrow and look at the fence." He came the next morning with a post digger and fresh lumber that he had clearly purchased the day before, which meant he had been fairly confident she would say yes. And she thought that if it had been a different kind of confidence it would have irritated her. But it was the practical, preparatory confidence of someone who simply likes to be ready, and she found she could not be annoyed at that. He worked from just after sunup until mid-afternoon on the fence, and she worked her own morning chores alongside her usual work. And every so often she looked over and watched him, and he was simply working, efficiently and without drama. And when she brought water out to him at noon, he thanked her with the directness of a man who accepts a kindness without making a performance of it. Clara came out in the afternoon, because she had been watching from the window for the entire morning, and she walked up to Owen where he was tamping a new post and said, quite directly, "Are you the man who keeps putting Mama's furniture back?" Owen straightened up and looked at the girl with the same full attention he gave to everything, and he said, "I am." Clara looked at him for a long moment with her father's dark eyes. "Why?" "Because it belongs here," he said. Clara considered this. Then she said, "The settee has a loose button on the left cushion. I've been meaning to tell Mama." "I'll have a look at it," he said. That evening, after Owen had left for the day, Clara came into the kitchen where Bessie was making supper and said, without particular emphasis, "I like him, Mama." Bessie stirred the pot. "Do you?" she said. "Pepper likes him too," Clara said, with the air of someone presenting conclusive evidence. "Pepper likes everyone," Bessie said. "No, he doesn't," Clara said with the accuracy of someone who knows her dog. "He didn't like Mr. Crane from the bank. He growled at him." "Pepper has good taste," Bessie said, and left it at that, but she was smiling at the pot. Owen came back the next day and the day after that. He was fixing things: the gate on the south pasture, a loose board on the barn, the hinge on the chicken coop door that had been making a terrible noise for months. He did not ask permission for any of it. He simply noticed what needed doing and did it, and when she pointed out that she had not hired him to fix her gate, he said the gate needed fixing and he was here, and that seemed sufficient logic to him. She began to talk to him. Not just the practical morning water conversations, but actually talk, during the noon rest when the sun was high, and they sat in the shade of the barn and ate whatever she had packed, biscuits and cheese most days, or cold venison when she had it. And she told him things she had not told anyone else. About how hard the month since Carl's death had been. About how she lay awake at night adding numbers that wouldn't add up. About how Clara had started putting little stones in a row on the porch, one for each day, and Bessie had not had the heart to ask her why, but she thought it might be the way Clara was counting something she couldn't name. He told her things too. He told her about growing up on a small farm in East Texas that had gone under when the drought hit in the late 1860s, and how his father had never quite recovered from that loss, not financially but internally, in some deep part of himself. He told her about 15 years of working cattle, starting when he was 17, and about the trail drives up through Texas and Kansas, and what it was like to ride with 200 head through a river crossing in a lightning storm. He told her that he had wanted his own land for as long as he could remember, and that he had been patient about it because he had seen what impatience cost, but that patience had a way of making a man wonder sometimes if he had confused patience with fear. Fear of what? She said. He was quiet for a moment, turning a piece of dry grass between his fingers. Fear that by the time I found the right place, the right time would have passed, he said. He did not look at her when he said it. She did not say anything either for a moment. Then she said, "What does the right time look like in your experience?" He looked at her then. The Nevada sky was enormous and blue behind him. "I think it looks like this," he said quietly. "I think it looks like sitting in the shade with someone worth sitting with and the land being good around you and the work being real." She looked down at the biscuit in her hand. Her heart was doing something complicated and she preferred to let it do it privately. "That's a very particular description," she said. "I'm a particular man," he said. The October payment was due in 2 weeks. Bessie had accumulated, with the furniture sales and the money Owen had paid, about $40 of the $60 needed. She still had the china cabinet, the cedar chest, the 2 oil lamps and the bedroom suite, the tall walnut headboard, the matching wardrobe and washstand. She was not going to sell the bedroom suite if she could help it, because it was where Clara slept now, in the big bed, curling up in the middle of it the way a small child fills a space differently than you expect. She sold the china cabinet to Mrs. Harlan at the hotel, who had been admiring it for months, and that got her another $12. She was $3 short of the payment with 4 days to spare when Owen showed up one morning with a proposal she had not anticipated. "I'd like to buy a share of the cattle herd," he said. He was standing at the paddock fence with his coffee, and he said it the way you say something you have thought through carefully. "Not all of them. 20 head. At fair market value, which I've looked up at the cattle exchange in Carson City. That would put you over your payment and give you a reserve for the next quarter." She looked at him. "You want to own part of my cattle?" "I want to invest in a good operation," he said. "Your cattle are healthy and well kept. It's a sound investment." "And if I can't make the next payment," she said. "Then we negotiate," he said, "fairly." She looked at the cattle in the field, the familiar bunch of them moving slow in the morning light. "You're being very careful with how you word things," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Why?" He turned from the fence and looked at her. "Because the way you take care of a person matters as much as the care itself," he said, "and I don't want to do this wrong." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, 20 head at fair market value, and I want it written in a proper letter of agreement." "Of course," he said. They rode into town that afternoon, and Emmett Clark at the telegraph office, who also served as a notary because small towns in the territories made do with what they had, witnessed and recorded the agreement. 20 head of cattle, sold to Owen Ford at market value, with a right of first refusal on any future sale. Bessie took the money and walked it directly to the First Territorial Bank of Redemption and set it on Aldous Crane's desk, $3 more than the required payment, and told him she would need a receipt. Crane counted it with an expression of mild professional disappointment and gave her the receipt. She thanked him formally and walked out into the October sunlight and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. Owen was waiting by the horses. He looked at her face and said nothing, just handed her Admiral's reins. He had let her ride Admiral that day because her own horse had a tender shoe, and she handed them back and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, side by side on the road, and the light was gold and long across the valley, and the mountains were turning the first pale purple of evening on their upper slopes, and Bessie thought that the valley was beautiful in a way she had stopped noticing for a while, the way grief turns the world a little gray, and now color was coming back. The weeks that followed were the most interesting weeks Bessie could remember in a long time. Owen had taken to riding over in the morning and working the ranch through the day, and she had begun to think of his horse Admiral's arrival at the gate as a natural part of the day's rhythm, like the rooster or the coffee going on the stove. He was easy to work with, which she had not fully expected. She had expected to have to negotiate her authority over her own place, because that was the way of things with men. But Owen never once suggested that she didn't know exactly what she was doing. He took her lead. When she said a thing needed doing a certain way, he did it that way, and when he thought she was wrong, he said so directly and gave his reasoning. And sometimes she agreed and sometimes she didn't, and either way it was a conversation between two people who respected each other's competence, which was the most valuable kind. Clara had decided that Owen was her project. She followed him around explaining things to him with great authority. The names of the chickens, the habits of the border collie Pepper, the location of the best climbing tree on the property, the rules that she had established for a game that seemed to have no fixed structure but an elaborate set of regulations. Owen listened to all of it with the same attention he gave everything, and he asked questions that showed he had been paying attention, and Clara glowed with the satisfaction of a child who is being genuinely heard. One evening in late October, he stayed for supper for the first time. Bessie had made a proper meal, a beef stew with biscuits, not because she had planned to invite him, but because she had made too much and waste was a sin, and he was there. He helped Clara with the biscuits, rolling them out, and Clara directed the operation with a spoon, and he followed her instructions with perfect seriousness. After supper, after Clara was in bed, they sat on the porch in the cool dark. The stars were out again, the great blazing wash of them, and the coyotes were talking somewhere to the south, and Pepper was asleep across the threshold in the way that made leaving without disturbing him a logistical challenge. "I've been thinking about the Dawson land," Owen said. "And," she said. "I'm not going to buy it," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to buy any of the available land in this valley because the land I'm most interested in is already occupied." The night air moved between them. Bessie looked out at the dark. "Owen," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know it's too soon. I know what's right and what's wrong in terms of timing, and I'm not going to push on that. I'm telling you how things stand with me because I think you deserve honesty about it, not because I expect anything in return." She looked at him then, at his profile against the night sky. "How long have you felt this way?" she asked. He thought about it. "Since the first morning I put that rocking chair back on your porch," he said. "There's something about a person who puts a price tag on their grandmother's chair rather than ask for help. It says something about them. It might say that they're stubborn to the point of foolishness," she said. "It says they have pride that comes from somewhere real," he said, "and that they know what a thing is worth." She turned back to look at the stars. The feeling in her chest was large and warm and complicated, shot through with threads of grief because loving anything meant remembering what it cost to lose, and she was not done grieving Carl, probably would not be done for a long time, and she thought that was something Owen understood, because he was patient in the way of a man who does not mistake slowness for weakness. "I am not ready," she said, "for more than what we have now." "I know," he said, "what we have now is good." "It is," she agreed. And she meant it as a complete thing, not a lesser version of something else. What they had now was good, the work and the noon shade and the biscuits and the conversations and the porch evenings, and it was enough for right now, and right now was all she could manage. He stayed for supper more often after that. It became one of those things that happens by degrees, without a specific moment of decision. He was there in the evening, and then he was staying for supper, and then she was setting a place for him without thinking about it. And Clara was telling him what had happened at school in town that day. And Pepper had abandoned any pretense of loyalty to Bessie, and was sleeping at Owen's feet half the time. November came and the cold settled seriously into the valley. The first snow of the season came in on a northern wind that rattled the windows and turned the sage to silver. And Owen spent 2 days building up the barn insulation against the cold with bales of straw. And Bessie spent those 2 days making sure the water supply to the cattle was clear and the animals were healthy. On the evening of the second day, when the snow had stopped and the world was white and still, and the moon made everything glow faintly blue, Owen came out of the barn and found Bessie standing in the yard looking at the sky, and he stood beside her, and they were close enough that their breath made small clouds that mingled in the air between them. He took her hand. He did it simply, as if it were a natural thing, and it was his working hand, rough and warm, and he held hers lightly, not gripping, not claiming, just holding. She looked down at their hands for a moment and then looked back up at the sky and did not pull away, and they stood like that for a long time in the cold white night, and the coyotes were quiet and the cattle were settled and the smoke from the chimney went straight up in the still air. She thought, I am going to love this man. She thought it with the calm recognition of something inevitable, not frightening, just true. Like looking at the sky and recognizing it is going to rain. You can't stop the rain, and you don't need to. You just need to decide if you're standing out in it or not. Winter deepened into December. Owen had taken a room at the ranch rather than continue the daily ride from the hotel, which they had negotiated with great propriety. She had the spare room off the kitchen that had been Carl's workroom, and she had cleared it and put a cot in it. And Owen paid her a fair rent for it out of the wages she had started paying him, which she was able to do now because the cattle operation was ticking along properly for the first time since Carl's death. He had also brought 3 of his own horses to the ranch, stabling them with her too, which meant the paddock was more full than it had been in years and the hay bill was higher, but so was the general sense of life in the place. They were careful with each other. There was a boundary that existed between them that neither of them crossed, not from fear or propriety exactly, but from a shared understanding that they were building something, and that the building had to go in the right order. You could not put the roof on before the walls were up, but the Christmas of 1874 tested that boundary a little. Clara had asked Bessie to help her make a present for Owen, which she insisted be kept a complete secret, and Bessie had helped her make a small leather bookmark with a simple pattern stamped into it, because Owen was a reader. She had noticed the 2 books he had brought with him, a Bible and a battered copy of Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, which he read in the evenings by the kitchen lamp. On Christmas morning, Clara presented the bookmark with enormous ceremony, standing in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her dark hair loose, holding it out with both hands. Owen took it and looked at it for a long moment, and when he looked up at Clara his face had an openness that he usually kept fairly guarded, and he said, "This is the finest gift I have received in a very long time." Clara climbed into his lap and pressed her face against his chest in the way that children do when they are so pleased they need to hide it, and Owen held her with one arm and looked at Bessie over the top of Clara's head, and the look on his face was something she had to look away from because it went straight through her. She had made him a proper Christmas dinner, and she had baked a dried apple pie, which was a minor miracle of economy given what dried apples cost in December. They sat at the dining table, which was back in its proper place in the dining room, having been moved inside permanently when the weather turned, and ate. And Clara talked about what she wanted to be when she grew up, which changed 3 times during the meal from schoolteacher to horse doctor to the person who names mountains, which she felt was an underappreciated occupation. After, in the evening, Owen said quietly to Bessie, "I have something for you." He went to the spare room and came back with a small flat package wrapped in brown paper, and she opened it and found a piece of calico fabric in a blue and white pattern, enough for a dress or a good blouse, and a packet of hairpins, because he had noticed her constantly retrieving hairpins from the floor of the kitchen. She held both things and felt something very near to undone. "How did you know about the hairpins?" she said. "You lose about 4 a morning," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that gets away from you before you're ready for it, and the sound of it made Owen's whole face change in the way she had come to recognize that private quality of gladness he seemed to keep mostly for her. January brought a hard freeze and a sickness that went through the valley that was thankfully milder than the one that had taken Carl, and Clara caught a version of it that kept her in bed for a week but was not, thank God, dangerous. Owen helped nurse her without being asked, sitting with her in the evenings reading Ivanhoe aloud in a voice that was patient and clear, while Bessie made broth and warm compresses. On the 4th night of Clara's illness, Bessie fell asleep in the chair in the corner of Clara's room from sheer exhaustion, and when she woke the lamp was turned down and a blanket had been placed over her, and Clara was asleep, and Owen was gone. She sat in the near dark for a moment with the blanket around her and the warmth of that simple, tended care moving through her, and she thought, "I am already in love with this man. Past tense. It has already happened. I have been going about it backward, as though it hasn't happened yet, but it has." Clara recovered fully by the end of the week, bouncing back with the elastic energy of children who are constitutionally healthy, and everything returned to the ordinary rhythms of the ranch in winter. On a Sunday in late January after church, Owen and Bessie were walking back to where the horses were tied, and she said, without particularly planning to say it, "I think I would like you to stay." He stopped walking. "I am staying," he said carefully. "I'm in the spare room." "I know that," she said. "I mean more permanently than the spare room." He looked at her. The January sky was pale and clean above the town, and there was ice on the water trough outside the livery, and the street was mostly empty. "Bessie," he said, and the way he said her name, just her first name, plain and direct and full of something, made her face warm despite the cold. "I am not rushing anything," she said. "I am just telling you what I think, because you were honest with me about where you stood, and I believe in the same kind of honesty. I am not done grieving Carl, and I think I will carry him in some part of me always, but that is not the same as not being able to love someone else. And I believe, I am fairly certain that I love you. And I don't want to keep not saying it as though not saying it makes the thing I'm trying to protect less fragile." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you. I've been careful not to crowd that at you, but since you've said it, I want to be clear. I love you. And Clara, I love the two of you." She nodded once, the way she nodded when she was very certain about something. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts amused and moved, which was an expression she had come to realize was distinctively his. "We understand each other," he agreed. He asked her to marry him in February, on a Tuesday morning, which was an unusual day for a proposal, but Owen Ford did not do things for appearance's sake. He waited until Clara had gone to school in town with Mrs. Chambers, who gave several of the surrounding ranch children a ride in her wagon each morning, and then he came into the kitchen where Bessie was doing the bread, and he stood across the table from her and said, "I would like to marry you, Bessie, not as a business arrangement, not as a solution to a financial problem, because you've already solved that yourself. As my wife, because I want to spend my life with you, and I want to be a proper father to Clara if she'll have me, and I want to run this ranch with you for the rest of whatever years I get, and I think you and I together are something better than either of us is separately, and I'm not a man who talks a lot, but I want to say that clearly, so there's no ambiguity." She had flour on her hands, and she looked down at them for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and she said, "Yes. Yes, Owen." He came around the table, and she met him halfway, and he held her face in his hands gently and kissed her, and she put her flour-covered hands on his chest and kissed him back, and it was a very good kiss, warm and certain, the kind that doesn't have any hesitation in it because both people are fully present. When Clara came home that afternoon, Bessie and Owen sat her down and told her. Clara was quiet for a moment, which was unusual, and Bessie's heart tightened with the worry that she had misjudged. Then Clara said, looking at Owen with her father's serious dark eyes, "Will you still read to me at night?" "Every night you want," he said. "And will you still let Pepper sleep on your feet even though Mama says he has his own spot?" "We'll keep that between us," he said. Clara nodded with the air of someone whose terms have been met. "All right," she said. Then she hugged him, and he hugged her back, and Bessie pressed her hand to her mouth and looked at the ceiling. They married in the Redemption Church on a Saturday in March of 1875, when the first green was coming back to the valley floor, and the mountains were still white at the top. The Reverend Means performed the ceremony, which was attended by Garvey and his wife, Pete Hollis, who cried unexpectedly and was embarrassed about it, Mrs. Chambers, Tommy and Sam from the livery, Emmett Clark from the telegraph office, and several other people from town who had found reasons to be at the church that morning. Clara was the only attendant, wearing a new dress that Bessie had made from the blue and white calico Owen had given her at Christmas. She had made a dress for Clara and used what remained for herself, which meant they matched in a way that made several of the women in attendance press handkerchiefs to their eyes. The ceremony was simple. Owen said his vows in the same plain, direct way he said everything, with a steadiness that made the words feel like facts rather than performances. Bessie said hers clearly, with Clara's hand in her own, and she did not cry, which surprised her, because she had expected to. What she felt instead was a profound settledness, as though a compass needle that had been swinging uncertain had finally found its direction and gone still. Pete Hollis hosted a small celebration at his house afterward, because he had a good parlor and a wife, Dora, who made excellent cake. And they ate cake and drank cider, and Emmett played the fiddle, and everyone danced, including Owen, who danced with Bessie in the careful way of a man who is not a natural dancer, but is trying with genuine effort, and danced with Clara on his feet, which delighted her. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the three of them, and the valley was long and golden around them, and the mountains were pink in the evening light, and Pepper was waiting at the gate with the frantic relief of a dog who had been left behind for a very long time, which in dog terms was apparently about 6 hours. That night, after Clara was asleep, they sat together on the porch, not side by side now, but with Bessie's head against Owen's shoulder, and the stars were out in their millions, and the wind was mild and smelled of sage and distant rain, and Owen had his arm around her with the settled certainty of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. "What do you think Crane will say," she said, "when he comes for the next payment and finds a healthy herd and a working ranch and a woman who is no longer quite so alone?" She felt him smile above her head. "I think Crane will say whatever Crane says," he said, "and I think neither of us will care particularly." She laughed softly. "No," she said, "I don't think we will." In the spring, Owen drove to Carson City and brought back 2 more horses and a young ranch hand named Caleb, who was 18 and earnest and good with cattle, and the operation expanded in the right ways, cautiously and steadily, the way Owen did everything. The cattle numbers grew from 47 to 80 over the course of the year, and the fencing was sound, and the barn was solid, and there were chickens enough that they could sell eggs in town, which was Bessie's idea, and it was a good one. Bessie also started a kitchen garden in earnest that spring, larger than she had managed alone, and she grew enough tomatoes and beans and squash through the summer that she could put up provisions through the winter and have surplus to trade. Owen built her a proper root cellar, which took him and Caleb most of May, and when it was done she stood in it with the lamp and looked at the stone shelves and thought about what it meant to have enough room to put things by. Summer came on hot and bright, the way Nevada summers do, relentless and brilliant, and they worked the ranch through it together, the long days bookended by early mornings and evening porch sitting, and it was hard work and good work, the kind of work that builds something real. Clara turned 7 in July and declared that she wanted a dog of her own, since Pepper was so clearly Owen's dog now, which was a reasonable grievance. Owen came home from a trip to the neighboring Drum Ranch with a puppy, a spotted hound with enormous feet, that Clara named Captain, which was a name no one questioned because Clara named things with authority. The next payment to the bank was made on time, and the one after that, and Aldous Crane received each payment with his characteristic air of mild disappointment. In the fall of 1875, Bessie went to the bank and sat down across from Crane and asked him how much it would take to pay the mortgage in full. He told her. She said she needed to think about it, and she went home, and she and Owen sat at the dining table, the mahogany table, back in its proper home, solid and beautiful, and they went through the ledger together, and the numbers were not there yet, but they were close enough to see from where they were standing. 2 more seasons, Owen said, tracing a line in the ledger with his finger. If the market holds and the herd stays healthy and we don't have a catastrophic winter, 2 seasons and we own this outright. She nodded. 2 seasons. She could hold 2 seasons. She held them. The winters were cold but not catastrophic. The herd stayed healthy. The market held more or less. Caleb proved to be an exceptionally good stockman, and Owen found him 2 more hands in the spring of 1876, brothers named Eli and Tom Reyes, who had come up from New Mexico and were steady workers. The operation was, by the fall of 1876, a proper, thriving ranch rather than the threadbare, frightened thing it had been when Bessie had carried that rocking chair to the roadside. In the fall of 1876, a year and a half after the wedding, Bessie told Owen she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, before Clara was up, quietly, holding her coffee cup in both hands. He went very still in the way he went still when something important was happening. Then he set down his cup and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her and said, "Are you all right? How do you feel? Is everything is fine," she said, laughing at the catalogue of worry in his voice. "I feel perfectly well. I just wanted you to know." He pressed his forehead to hers and stood like that for a moment, and then he kissed her, and then he said, "Clara is going to tell this child everything there is to know about the proper naming of chickens within about a week of its arrival." "Within a day," Bessie said. The spring of 1877 was warm and early, and the wildflowers came up through the sage in a wash of purple and yellow that made the valley look like something from a painting. And on a morning in late April, with Owen sitting outside the bedroom door, absolutely rigid with controlled anxiety, while the doctor and Mrs. Chambers attended to Bessie inside, a baby boy was born. He came into the world with Owen's dark brown hair and Bessie's stubborn jaw, and a voice that suggested he had opinions about everything, and intended to express them immediately. Owen was allowed in after what he later described as the longest 20 minutes of his life, and he held his son in his arms with the overwhelmed, slightly stunned expression of a man who thought he knew what this would feel like, and finds he was comprehensively wrong. They named him James Carl Ford. James for Owen's father, Carl for Bessie's first husband, and Ford because that was what they were now, all of them, that whole complicated gathered-together family. Clara inspected the baby with her characteristic serious thoroughness, and declared him satisfactory, though small. She took her role as older sister with the same authority with which she named animals and directed biscuitrolling, and within a week she had established herself as the person who narrated the baby's existence to anyone who would listen. In the late spring of 1877, Bessie and Owen walked into the First Territorial Bank of Redemption on a Thursday morning and paid off the mortgage in full. Aldous Crane received the money with his hands, and his face registered something that was almost a moment of genuine human feeling, a flicker of something that might have been respect, before it settled back into its professional blankness, and he issued them the deed free and clear. Bessie held the deed outside on the boardwalk in the bright Nevada sun. Owen stood beside her. She turned the paper over in her hands, reading the words, feeling the paper. "It's ours," she said. "It was always yours," he said. She looked at him. "It's ours," she said again, deliberately, and something in her voice made it clear she was talking about more than the land. He took her hand, there on the boardwalk in the middle of Redemption's Main Street in broad daylight, and she let him, and Pete Hollies, who happened to be coming out of the mercantile across the street, shouted, "Well, it's about time," which made no particular sense since they had been married for 2 years, but which felt appropriate all the same. They celebrated that evening with a dinner that was the most extravagant Bessie had made in years. A roasted chicken from their own flock, potatoes from the root cellar, early spring greens, and another dried apple pie, because it was the occasion for one. Caleb and Eli and Tom came in from the bunkhouse. They had a proper bunkhouse now, built in the fall, and sat around the dining table, the mahogany table that had been bought and returned and bought again, and now would never leave. And the conversation ran loud and cheerful and full of the ease of people who have worked together long enough to know each other. Clara sat next to Owen with James on her lap, because Clara had a gift for holding the baby that Bessie recognized as genuine competence, and not just enthusiasm. She was 8 now, serious and bright and full of opinions, and she had her father Carl's dark eyes and her mother's jaw, and something all her own that was partly Owen's steadiness, and partly just Clara's own particular self. After supper, after Caleb and the Ray's brothers had gone back to the bunkhouse and Clara was in bed with James in the cradle beside her, because she had insisted that she could hear him if he woke up, Bessie and Owen sat on the porch again, in the rocking chair and the chair beside it, in the dark that was now the dark of late spring, warm and full of insect song. "I want to tell you something," Bessie said. She was rocking slowly, the runner of the old ash rocking chair moving quiet on the porch boards. "About when I put this chair out by the road." "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "I want to. When I carried it out there, I thought it was the beginning of losing everything. I thought the ranch was going to go, and then I didn't know what Clara and I would do, and I was so—" she stopped, found the word. "I was so frightened," under the composed part. "I was absolutely frightened." "Anyone would have been," he said. "But then I found it back on the porch," she said. "The chair, in the morning. And I didn't know who or why, and I was suspicious about it and grateful about it in equal measure, and it was the first time in months that I thought someone sees this. Someone saw what was happening here and it mattered to them. And that was," she rocked for a moment quiet. "That was when I started to think that maybe things could be all right. Not because someone fixed everything, because they didn't, but because someone noticed. That's all it was. Someone noticed." Owen looked at her in the dark for a long time. "You deserve to be noticed," he said simply. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers. And they sat like that in the dark with the stars coming out one by one above the Nevada Valley, and the cattle quiet in the field, and the horses moving gentle in the paddock. And from inside the house, the faint sleeping breath sound of children, and the sound of everything they had built together being exactly where it was supposed to be. The summer of 1877 deepened and turned. Owen took on 2 more cattle contracts, which meant driving 120 head to the railhead at Winnemucca, and he was gone for 3 weeks in July. And Bessie ran the ranch with Caleb and the Ray's brothers, and did it without a single thing going wrong that she could not handle, which did not surprise her, because she was a woman who had put a price tag on her grandmother's rocking chair rather than ask for help, which meant she was fundamentally capable of handling anything. Owen came back from Winnemucca with money enough to buy 20 more head and refence the north pasture, and with a length of blue ribbon that he had bought at a dry goods store there. And Bessie had looked at the ribbon and looked at him and said, "What is the ribbon for?" And he had said, "For your hair, if you want it." And the combination of the practicality and the absolute uncomplicated affection of it had made her press both hands over her face for a moment. By the fall of 1877, the Pritchard Ford Ranch, They kept Pritchard in the name because Bessie said it was her name and the ranch's name, and they could add Ford to it. And Owen agreed without argument, which was one of the many things she loved about him, was one of the better-regarded operations in the valley. Bert Stokes had finally come to redemption, the man whose letter had brought Owen west in the first place, and when he saw the ranch and the operation and then saw Owen and Bessie standing side by side in the yard, he had shaken his head and said, "You wrote me you were looking at land. You found considerably more than land." Owen had said, "I did." Bert had bought 30 acres on the eastern side of the valley, and they were neighbors now, and he came for Sunday dinner sometimes, which Clara approved of because he could whistle bird calls with convincing accuracy and was willing to do so on request. In the second winter, when James was 7 months old and pulling himself up on everything and making Pepper very nervous by grabbing his tail, Bessie began teaching him to read, not James, who was 7 months old and not ready for reading, but Clara, who was already learning her letters at the school in town. She went over the lessons in the evenings at the writing desk, the brass-fitted writing desk that was back in its corner of the sitting room, and Owen sat nearby with Ivanhoe or the Bible or the copy of a cattle management pamphlet he had sent away from a press in San Francisco, and James sat in his lap chewing on things, and the lamp made the room gold and warm. The years settled. 1878 brought a good cattle season and a violent late spring storm that took down part of the barn roof, which Owen and Caleb rebuilt over a week that was loud with hammering and mildly profane. And then 1879 came and Clara was 11 and James was 2 and Bessie was, it turned out, expecting again. She told Owen in the kitchen again in the same quiet morning way, and he responded with considerably more composure this time, though she could see him fighting a smile that kept winning. "Are you all right?" he said. "Perfectly well," she said. He did smile then fully. "Clara is going to take this baby's entire education in hand before it can walk," he said. "Clara takes everything in hand," Bessie said fondly. The baby came in the autumn of 1879, a girl this time, which Clara said was obviously going to happen, because Captain the Hound had been acting very peculiar all summer, and Clara had taken this as a sign. She was named Ruth Ford for no particular reason except that Bessie had always loved the name, and Ruth because Owen's mother had been Ruth, and he had not asked for it and she had offered it, and his face had done the thing it did when something moved him deeply, where it stayed very still and only his eyes changed. So they were 5 on the ranch, with the 3 hands and the 2 dogs and the growing herd and the root cellar full of provisions and the mortgage paid and the deed clear, and the rocking chair on the porch where it had always lived, worn smooth on the arms from years of hands, and the mahogany dining table full of people come supper time. Bessie was 33 years old and Owen was 37. And they had been through the kind of things that either break people or bind them, and they were bound, in the way of people who have worked the same land and weathered the same seasons and known each other in the ordinary daily light that is more revealing than any dramatic moment. One morning in October, the 3rd October since their wedding, the anniversary month of that first payment that had nearly broken her, Bessie came out to the porch in the early light with her coffee, and sat in her grandmother's rocking chair, and looked at the valley coming up into morning. The way the light began in the east as a pale line and spread slow and warm across the sage and the grass and the peaks of the mountains went amber first, like something lit from inside. Owen came out and stood in the doorway with James on his hip, the boy still in his night clothes, blinking and ruffled, and me in Bessie's arms. She had been carrying her since before coming outside, the baby content and drowsy. "Good morning," Owen said. "Good morning," she said. He came and sat on the porch rail, which he always did because he said chairs were too much commitment for early morning, and James leaned against him still half asleep, and me made a small sound that was not quite words yet but was practicing at them, and Pepper came around the corner of the house from wherever he had spent the night, and climbed the steps and lay down across everyone's feet in the impartial way of dogs who love everyone equally. Clara came out a few minutes later in her dress but without her boots, because she was 11 and mornings were for her a negotiated process, and she leaned against the doorframe and yawned enormously and then noticed the morning light on the mountains and said, "That is very beautiful." "It is," Bessie agreed. They were all quiet for a moment, the 5 of them and the 2 dogs in the morning, and the valley spread out before them. 340 acres of good creek water and proven grazing and hard-won ground, and the cattle moving slow in the far field, and the smoke beginning to come up from the bunkhouse where Caleb and Eli and Tom were waking to their own day. And the world had the clear, certain quality it gets on good autumn mornings when the air is cold and the light is young. "Are you thinking about something?" Owen said, watching her. She looked at him across the porch, her husband, with their son leaning into his side and the morning light on his face. And she thought about that first morning when she had found the rocking chair back on the porch, and had stood in the road in the half-dark holding a fold of bills and wondering who could possibly have done such a thing. She thought about the dining table and the writing desk and the settee with the green cushions, all of them returned in the before-sunrise dark. She thought about standing in the shadow at the edge of the road in the cold October night waiting to see who was doing it, and Owen's face in the moonlight when she had called his name. She thought about coffee in the lamplight that first morning, and the noon shade on the barn side, and a Christmas morning with flower-covered hands. She thought about how much could change in the space of a few years if the right person happened to ride through the right town at the right time, and have the particular kind of decency that doesn't ask for recognition. "I was thinking," she said, "that this is exactly what I would choose if I were given the choosing." Owen looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he was very certain about something, and the corner of his mouth moved, and she knew that expression by heart now, had memorized it the way you memorize the landmarks of a place you love. "Same," he said. And the morning came on full and golden over the Pritchard Ford ranch, and the mountains stood clear against the deep blue Nevada sky, and the rocking chair moved gentle on the porch boards, and all the things that had been nearly lost were where they belonged, and the day was beginning, and everything was more than all right.